Hello, welcome back. This is part 5 of a series I'm doing called How the Church Started. If you haven't seen the first 4 videos, please turn this one off and go watch those 4 as they are instrumental and foundational in this video and the subsequent videos. First couple of videos I talked about the structure of the church that was sort of being developed, and I talked about the Apostle Paul and how Rome sort of left off, how Rome started to gain popularity in the latter portion of the first century. Ephesus, we saw the early portion of Christianity. Jerusalem was the epicenter of Christianity. Then it shifted to Ephesus in the middle of the first century, toward the latter portion of the first century. And then toward the end of the first century, Rome starts to gain a lot of popularity. And by the end of the second century, by about 180 AD, Rome then becomes the epicenter for Christianity and the spread of Christianity. And so again, just to recap, sort of the way the churches were functioning was the apostles would go, they would preach in the city, people would get saved, they'd start a church, they would mentor them, shepherd them. From amongst that group, they'd raise up the church leaders, the pastors, the elders. They would function as a team. It's called a plurality of headship, where there wasn't just one guy running the show or one boss. There were multiple guys working together. They were of equal status. There was usually one guy who was sort of a leader among leaders, who would rise up and do most of the teaching and make a lot of the decisions. But for the most part, these guys there was not one guy the boss of the other. They were equal and they shared the load in running the church. And then there was these bishops. The apostles sort of served as overseers over different churches. And then as the apostles died off, there were other pastors. A lot of the guys would be a pastor in one city, but would also be an overseer over different churches and would serve in that bishop role. And the elders of the local church would be accountable to the bishop. And then all the bishops, when they met together on a regular basis, they would keep each other accountable and would challenge one another. And so this structure helped keep the church on the same page for much of it. And so through this, we see great expansion. They're very organized in how they're. We go from this informal structure to a somewhat strong structure of organization, and we see the gospel expanding quite a bit. But one of the biggest reasons we see some expansion of the church is persecution. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple, and the Jews were scattered all over the world. And so you have these Jewish Christians who are living in Israel that are being murdered and killed and forced out of their city, run out of town. They're moving to all different places of the world, being scattered to all different cities and all different countries, even outside of the Roman Empire. And everywhere they go, they preach the gospel, and churches start popping up all over the place. The other great, and so from about 70 AD to about 300 AD, you're talking 230 years of tremendous persecution. Sometimes it was less than others. Some emperors weren't as anti-Christ as others were. Some were kind of let the Christians go. Some were just brutal. I think I said in a previous video, some of the emperors would let Christians on fire in their as they would use the human live Christians as torches. The gladiators in the Colosseum used Christians for practice. They would murder them and kill them. One emperor in the early part of the 2nd century maimed a bunch of Jewish Christians, cut off one arm and one leg of each Jewish Christian. I mean, just crazy, brutal, violent persecution. And this led to a lot of people getting saved. I mean, because the reality is this: if you're not a Christian, you see these people who are Christians who love their God, and no matter what they do, they're walking with integrity, and they're showing people love and respect, and they're serving God even in the face of brutal, violent persecution. A lot of people begin to say, man, these guys are legit. These guys are for real. And the persecution was a direct reason why the Christianity expanded and grew. First, because people were being scattered all over the Roman Empire, but secondly, they led such an example. And there's no doubt that the Apostle Paul gave us the example of laying down our lives and be willing to be beaten and take pain and be persecuted for the cause of Christ, and to do whatever it takes to see the gospel taken to where it had never been taken before. And I would encourage every single one of us to follow Paul in that example. And the early church certainly did follow Paul in that example. And so, so we see these bishops, and then, these sort of bishop system. And as in the early part of the 2nd century, 100 AD to 120 AD, well, before that, you had the Apostle John was the last living apostle. And from about 90 AD to about 100 AD, he served as the pastor in the church of Ephesus in the latter years of his life, the church that Paul had started, 30 years earlier. He serves as the pastor of that church. And he also served as the bishop as all the churches in the region around it. And when all the bishops from all around would meet together in different councils, John was sort of the leader among leaders because he was the last living apostle. When he died, you slowly begin to see the power shifting toward Rome, specifically because of a guy named Clement, who was the bishop in Rome, and he was the pastor of the church there, and he oversaw many churches there. And some scholars say that he actually was a major force in sending missionaries from Rome to other parts of Europe, of Western Europe, of what is modern-day Spain, modern-day France, modern-day England, and to portions of northwestern Africa, and played a huge portion of spreading the gospel. And he became sort of one of the main. It was three guys: Clement, Polycarp, and Ignatius. But Clement really became, in the western portion of the Roman Empire, he really became sort of the main guy in Rome. And because the Roman Church began to take the charge, it became natural that he sort of became the most influential of all the leaders amongst all the bishops in the first and second century. He wrote many writings and letters, and just was a great catalyst for the gospel being spread to what is modern day Western Europe. And so we see great things, and we see the church being on the same page. There wasn't this two different churches right across the street from each other preaching two different things. That didn't happen back then. All the churches, because all the bishops would meet together and they held each other accountable, and they were very good about all the churches on the same page. You can see different writings from all the different church leaders and church fathers from the second century, between 115 AD to 180 AD, from all over the Roman Empire. And some of these teachings they all agree with the Apostle Paul's letters. They all agreed with the teachings of the apostles from Jerusalem in the first century, and they all agree on very specific points of doctrine, and they're all concurrent, they're all congruent. It is amazing what happens. So we see over a period of time rapid evolution and major changes in the Roman world, and the expansion of the church between 150 and 180 AD. 180 AD, we're talking 160 years after Jesus' resurrection. We're talking 120 years after Peter and Paul have been executed. 120 years is a long time. Think about the United States. Where we're coming 120 years. A lot of changes in the Roman Empire is going on at this time period, but the church continues to expand, continues to grow. And it began to do several other things that are pretty amazing. In Rome, it was just a brutal culture. It was sexual as can be. Some experts I've read, one historian says that he estimates probably 95% of the people were bisexual, and probably 80 to 90% of the people in Rome participated in orgies on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis. All throughout the Roman Empire, specifically in Rome, there were bathhouses where men would go and have they would bathe in a big steam house and have this big sex orgies all day long. It was just gross. And then there was political corruption that had been the worst I'd ever seen. At this point, it's a complete monarchy. The people have lost all their rights, and their liberties have been completely eroded, and the emperor is just mean, and most of them are brutal and mean. And this is just a wicked, sinful culture. But the Christians are very different. A lot of the people, they would kill the sick people. If you were old and you got sick, they just kill you. If you were a baby with a deformity, they just kill you. But these Christians, or they would just abandon you. So these Christians start adopting babies, and they start taking care of the sick and taking care of the poor. So not only are they legit and real, but they just start setting the example for love, and this is incredible. And right around 200 to 225 AD, you start seeing some of the political people in Rome, in rather parts of Rome, to start acknowledging some quality things in Christianity. But then you also see persecution get even worse. And from about 285 AD to 313 AD, it was called the last great pagan persecution, where there's one particular Roman emperor who said, that's it, once and for all, I'm going to wipe out these Christians. And it was the most brutal and most violent persecutions that the church had ever seen up to that point. And so this is sort of what goes on, and this is how what's going on. But the Christians are leading the way and showing love and laying down their lives and doing whatever, and the gospel spreading all over the place, all over the known world, from 150 AD all the way up to 300 AD. But eventually, in 313 AD, a guy named Constantine takes over. At this point, the Roman Empire had been split in two. They still worked together, but they were split in two. He was the leader of the western half, and eventually takes over the eastern half. And the next video, I'm going to talk about Constantine and how he had a tremendous impact over the trajectory of the church.